So welcome everybody. Many thanks for being here with us today. It is a great pleasure to have Branko Milanovic here presenting his latest book, Capitalism Alone. Branko, as you know, is a leading scholar on inequality. It is difficult to talk about inequality, let's say, for about 5 minutes without mentioning his name or any of his many contributions. So to give you some ideas, I mean, if you are discussing global inequality, sooner or later you're going to be talking about this elephant chart, in which he places the winners and the losers and winners of globalization in that global income distribution. Or if you would be talking about within country inequality, you are going to be referring to the Kuznets waves, which is another of Branko's main contributions. Or when wondering about ancient inequality, so you got the concept of inequality extraction rate, which is also, was created also with Peter Linder and Jeffrey Williamson. And of course, if you want to know something about inequality under communism, which is an apparent oxymoron, so you need to read Branko's work. So Branko is a visiting presidential professor at the Graduate Center in City University in New York. And this year we are very fortunate to have him with us at IBEI as a visiting fellow. For today's event, we have two discussants. So Francesc Amat, who is a research fellow at the Institutions and Political Economy Research Group at the University of Barcelona. And also we are very grateful to Cesc for accepting the invitation to be the discussant today. And the second discussant is going to be myself, Pablo Astorga. I'm Senior Research Fellow at IBEI, so I'm having two jobs today. I'm going to chair and then I'm going to be a discussant. The plan for tonight's event is to start with Branko presenting the book for about 40 minutes, and then that's going to be followed by the commentary, first by Cesc. Cesc will have about 15 minutes to talk, and I'm going to do 10 minutes. And then we give Branko the opportunity to reply, about 3 to 5 minutes, and then open discussion or the conversation to everybody in the room for about 30 minutes. So we are planning to finish at 1945, right? So 7:45. And I will try to stick with that schedule. I'm going to be very strict with the time. So Branko, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pablo. Thank you very much. Thanks also to Cesc for accepting to be the commentator. We would actually, thanks to Pablo, we are going to do, as we were discussing before, no Mediterranean time. So actually, you tell me exactly when I have only 3 to 4 minutes to go, or 2 minutes to go, because then I would really have to wrap up. I mean, I can obviously talk about this stuff for a very long time, so you don't want here to stay, you don't want to stay until, tomorrow morning. No, the book does exist, as you can see here. It can be ordered. You have actually there another copy of the book, and I think the forms. There was a little bit of a delay, I was told, because the publisher in England, it's published at the same time in the US and the UK, but the UK one actually, I don't know, was not really sending the books fast enough, but currently you can order it, they would send it to you, and they would charge you a reasonable price, hopefully. Now, what is I have to actually say something about the structure of the book, because what my presentation today would cover would be unofficially a book talk, but because the book is fairly diverse, and of course, as Pablo and Cesc know, it is very difficult to present, or actually rather impossible to present the whole book in one talk. So let me then give you the structure of the book. The first chapter is very brief, and it talks about the contours of the post-Cold War world. There are two essential things there. I will talk about one of, well, actually both of them today. One is I mean, that's what is in the title, Capitalism Alone, is the very fact that geographically, the dominion of capitalism had never been as huge as it is now. Actually, the entire world is capitalist, and obviously that was not the case before 1989, and it was not the case under the previous globalization, where you had, of course, large parts of the world which were, you know, under serfdom or slavery and so on. And just to remind you, in Central Europe, you had forced labor until 1848. In Russia, until 1861, you had also serfdom. In the US, until 1865, slavery. And then, of course, in Brazil, until 1888. So, you know, in those days, again, you had different modes of production. Nowadays, we have only one. Of course, you would ask me, how about China? And I will not talk about China today, although I understand that Cesc is going to ask me about that, because that's one of the chapters of the book, and which I actually really spent quite some time putting together. That's the chapter about political capitalism, but I will not talk in my presentation today about it. The second topic, of course, of the contours of the post-Cold War world is the rebalancing in incomes between Asia and Europe. And I intentionally call it rebalancing because, of course, students of economic history know that what we see now with China and India becoming richer is in the future, probably next 50 years, bringing back the relative levels of economic activity at the point where they were before the Industrial Revolution. In other words, before the Industrial Revolution, you had relatively small differences between Europe, Western Europe, and most developed parts of China, and that would be probably the case towards the end of, or maybe middle of this 21st century. So in that sense, it's rebalancing of the world, which is, of course, driven by the rise of Asia. So I will talk about chapter 2 today, so I will not say anything else more about that. Chapter 3 deals with political capitalism and, of course, uses the examples of China. Chapter 4 is the interaction of capitalism and globalization at 4 different sort of levels. One is labor, and there I discuss a very controversial part of the book, which was already present in the previous book, Global Inequality, but it's developed here. It's about migration. That's obviously a huge issue, particularly I think in Europe, and again, I will not talk about that today. Then I talk about globalization and capital, using global value chains in particular as a means whereby sort of capitalism has spread to the entire world. Then I talk very briefly about the welfare state under conditions of globalization. As you can imagine, as it was discussed, welfare state is under quite a lot of pressure with globalization. And then finally, another part which I actually like very much is about corruption. I think that we have to take corruption as almost a rental income. Corruption, I think, has become much more sort of obvious and much more present with globalization. And I think we should not take a moralistic attitude toward corruption, because basically we are working with numbers. We are economists. We are not preachers or priests or any other such high-level calling. So I think actually corruption is something which is really something which is not an anomaly, but it is really integral part of globalization. Finally, the future of global capitalism is a rather dark chapter, because I talk there about the invasion of basically capitalism into or marketization or commodification of our private lives. So when I said before that capitalism has been stronger now than ever in history, I meant in 2 dimensions. In the geographical dimension, in its spread across all the continents and countries, and in a dimension of new markets which it had created. Obviously, as you know, with Airbnb, our apartments have become commodified. With Uber and many other companies now, our cars have been commodified. With internet, our leisure time has been commodified. So we have really a huge invasion of commodification and of new markets, which is not dissimilar from what happened under the first industrial revolution. where likewise new markets were created. So these are the themes that I will not have really time to cover. You can read them here. It is actually the role of communism and in the sort of rise of countries of political capitalism, in particular China, and of the dominion of capitalism in our private life and the system of value which actually sustains that. So having said actually what I'm not going to talk, let me then start talking about what I really want to talk. And this is liberal or meritocratic capitalism. Now, to understand liberal meritocratic capitalism, I have to introduce different types of capitalism. And first, I have also to do a terminological sort of clarification. I did not introduce these terms like liberal and meritocratic just because they are cool, you know, and maybe other people use them. I actually take them directly from John Rawls. In Rawls's discussion, and of course, since I talk about inequality, I depend quite a lot on what Rawls has done, in the discussion of different types of equalities. Rawls takes as the lowest type of equality meritocratic. Meritocratic simply means that there are no legal impediments to you reaching a position in society or, you know, getting as rich as you can. In other words, there are no legal impediments which existed, for example, in societies where being a member of a nobility entitled you to certain positions, or in societies where actually you had slavery, so obviously the slaves could not accede to some positions. So it's simply a legal equality of everybody. So that's not really saying much. Liberal equality requires two adjustments, according to Rawls, and that's how I use it. It requires the adjustment of inheritance taxes in order to actually make the sort of playing field more even for people who come from poorer families, and it requires the adjustment of free public education. So a liberal capitalism would be, in that definition, a capitalism where you have reasonably high inheritance taxation and when you have reasonably common public schooling all the way up to including the college schooling. So as you can imagine, we can actually say that most of the Western societies are liberal, but as these two elements, inheritance taxation and even public education, recede, they may be moving toward more meritocratic. However, for my book, actually the distinction is not that important, so that's why I'm using liberal/meritocratic. But how does it differ from other types? And I would actually then start now explaining what I think is crucial, is that in a system of classical capitalism, or what you can call Ricardo Marx capitalism, the important thing to understand from an economic perspective is that the two sources of income, which are wages that are received by workers and interest, dividends, profits that are received by capital, are received by two kinds of people who are very different. Technically speaking, you can imagine a classical capitalism with all capitalists having only income from capital, workers having only income from labor, and all capitalists being richer than any worker. I will show you in a minute like a small graph of that. But you see there is no a single individual is not receiving both capital and labor income. So that's actually a very important distinction which I'm going to use quite a lot in the presentation. In liberal meritocratic capitalism, many people have income both from labor and capital, but the important part there to just sort of remember, because I will play on that part quite a lot in the presentation, is that the share of capital income rises as you become richer. So rich people are indeed different from other people, not only because they have higher income, because the composition of that income is skewed in favor of capital. I will give you later some numbers from the United States and other countries, but it's important to realize the logic of that. The rich people are people who basically have capital income, but they have also labor income, but they are actually, in terms of share of their income coming from capital, capital is much larger than among the middle class, or obviously the poor people have zero practically from capital. And then it might lead us then to what would be the people's capitalism, where the shares of capital and labor are more or less equal shares, not the amounts, are more or less equal across the whole population. This would all become much clearer in a second, where I showed you that in some kind of very sort of simple and nice graphs. So this would be now the distribution in classical capitalism. You have work, this is the income on the horizontal axis, and this is like distribution number of people or something. So you have workers, they are distributed by different wage level. They don't all have the same level. They have actually poor workers, middle income workers, and maybe rich, relatively rich workers. But what you notice there is that the workers' income distribution ends at the point where capitalist income distribution enters. In other words, in a different way to show that would be like this. This is actually now people ranked by total income from left to right, and this is the income level. So labor income goes up. You have actually, again, richer workers and poorer workers. But then the capitalists with their capital income kick in. So there is no one here with the blue income, which is capital income, which is poorer than somebody who has labor income only. So remember here, there is a full division between people who receive capital income and people who receive labor income. The recipients, you're either capitalist or you're a laborer. Now, there are people, mostly physicists, who actually work still with today's world and with today's data, trying to apply more or less this same idea. And actually there are people, for example, there was a guy who was my colleague at the Maryland, physicist, who actually, when he models the today's income distribution with 95% of people with log normal distribution, and the top 5% where capital income is predominant as Pareto distribution. And it's not a bad modeling, actually. He gets the results which really reflect more or less the actual distribution. So there is still some value to that sort of very classical capitalism, which of course is different from today's, but I'm just saying it's not sort of entirely unrealistic or crazy to think of this. So now, how does income in meritocratic capitalism look like? Labor income, again, I'm not paying much attention to labor income. It is increasing, you know. There are people, again, who are poor in terms of wages and who are middle income and who are richer people. But how would capital income look like? Well, in actual countries, the data that we have, you know, you have about 30% to 40% of people who have zero capital income. Then you have people who start having capital income. But notice how this line, the blue line of capital income, rises very quickly. So in other words, what is actually very specific to capital income is that as you move towards higher groups, the capital income not only rises, but rises very fast. Now, if you look at that, and people who have taken my class would immediately know that the Gini coefficient of the blue line of capital income is going to be higher than the Gini coefficient of the red line. So in other words, concentration of the capital income is going to be higher than concentration of labor income. This is going to play a big role in what I'm going to say in a minute. So, but remember that it's actually this blue line is very heavily concentrated. So it's not only that rich people receive more of it, they're actually being received in terms of quantities significantly in larger quantities are received by people who are at the very top. That's why this line goes suddenly so sharply up. Now, to fix the ideas, now let me show you then how it looks in real life with real data. So that's based on Luxembourg income study, microdata from the household surveys. The blue line is the Gini coefficient of capital. The red line is the Gini coefficient of labor. As you noticed, of course, for example, in some cases, you look at the UK, I'll show you that for Spain in 1 minute also. But look at the UK, you see the large increase in inequality of labor incomes in the 90s. Then it's kind of a stagnation of that. But what is present in every case is that the blue line, the Gini of capital income, is going to be significantly higher than the red line. To the ratio of 2 to 1, you have the Gini of the blue line, which is about 0.4, 0.45, even 0.5, but it never is 0.9 or the Gini of almost 0.95, which is implied with, of course, that small graph when you saw that very sharp increase in capital incomes, but in real life as well, you have extremely high concentration of capital incomes. So this is one part which has not really received, actually I think Piketty has contributed a lot of that by focusing on the importance of capital income and its extreme concentration at the top. You really cannot go very much above this, so this level, and that's why this blue line is more or less constant, simply because you cannot go with a Gini of 1. Once you're at the Gini of 0.90, you really don't have much space to increase further that concentration. Now, let me then compare that with how income in people's capitalism, which I argue in the book should be the next stage of capitalism, would look like. Now, labor income, let's suppose it remains the same because we are not focusing on that right now. But what would change is capital income. So notice what happens in this very simple graph is that now everybody has some capital income. You don't have the 30 or 40% of population with zero capital income. And capital income rises at the same rate at which labor income rises. This does not mean that you don't have poor and rich people. You know, people at the top, they are still ranked by total income. People at the top have more both of labor income and capital income. So they're richer in space of labor income and in space of capital income. But their shares are not different. So if I have 1,000 euro from labor and $1,000 from euro from capital, and you have 100 from labor and 100 from capital, obviously I'm richer, but the shares are the same. Now, you can say, why do I care about the shares? Because you're still richer than I. The reason why you should care about the shares is because of the rising importance of capital income in total national income or GDP. So when the total income from capital in GDP rises, that means automatically that you would have an increased inequality amongst individuals because the rich people receive large chunk of capital income. Now, in this people's capitalism, that doesn't happen. Because in the people's capitalism, if the capital income rises, because of external reasons, let's suppose globalization, robotics, digitalization, the capital share goes up in macro sense. But when it gets distributed amongst people, we don't get the same amounts, but we get the same shares compared to our original income. So in that case, the overall Gini coefficient doesn't go up. So it might seem at first kind of complicated, but the idea is the following. If you have an exogenous increase in capital income, and we are all receiving capital income here, in that case, and if the share of that capital income in our total income is for everybody the same, let's suppose 20%, then everybody's income will go up in the same proportion. And if everybody's income goes up in the same proportion, then you don't have an increase in interpersonal inequality. But if the entire income from capital is concentrated among three of us, then it would mean that if the exogenous increase in capital goes up because of, again, globalization, robotics, technological change, or whatnot, then it means that our incomes are going to go up, your incomes are not going to go up, and inequality will increase. So that's the basic logic that was actually it is driving this argument. Now, just for the simple sort of comparative purposes, let me show you how in a sort of ideal, typical socialism, the distribution would look like. Labor income is still the same, but capital income is distributed per capita basis, so equally to everybody. So notice now the differences. Now we have really, I think, a way, this is a very simple way to actually see these different systems. In the first one, then we would have, in classical capitalism, only capitalists have income from capital and they are all rich. In the second one, meritocratic or liberal capitalism, the richer ones have more of their income coming from capital. So the share of capital income in their own income is high. In the third one, which is people's capitalism, the shares are constant, but the rich people have obviously in the amounts more of capital income than the poor people. And finally, just simply to fix the idea, in socialism, you would have the same amount of income from capital for everybody. So remember here, the important distinction is between having the same amounts, which is somewhat unrealistic, but it's useful to actually have it as a sort of in your mind to see the difference, and having the same shares. So we are talking about the same shares. Now, you will see why these shares are going to play such a big role. I already mentioned that because they, to some extent, their role comes from the increasing aggregate importance of capital income in national income. So these are the 6 systemic inequalities. I'm not going to read them out now because you can read them on the slide, and I'm going to go through each of them individually. Some of them I will go very quickly because many people know that, so I don't need to spend much time. First is the increasing macro capital share. This is, of course, from one of the papers. There are many papers on that. And this is something which in the last 30 years, in all advanced economies and even in the emerging market economies, you have seen the rise in capital share. For the reasons that I mentioned before, whether it be globalization, technological change, policy changes, the decline of the trade unions, or whatever. Now, this particular graph would not play a very important role in our interpersonal inequality if the case was not that capital income is so heavily concentrated. So if the type of income which is heavily concentrated goes up in importance, then you have a quasi-automatic transmission from functional income distribution into interpersonal income distribution. And that's the key link. Now, here are the examples. I've already shown you US and UK. I put here Norway and Germany. You see everywhere the blue line, the Gini of capital income, is significantly larger than the Gini of labor income. So if capital income goes up in importance, then obviously the overall inequality, which is a convex function of these two, blue and red line, will go up. For Spain, this is the graph for Spain. You notice also here increasing inequality of labor incomes. You also notice increasing inequality, but then stagnation also of capital incomes. And of course, you notice that this number, I don't know why the graph all the way to 1.1. That was, I mean, it cannot go, the Gini cannot go over 1, obviously. But you see that actually in Spain, like for actually all the other countries, the Gini of capital income is about 0.95. If you want to do the same thing for different countries, just to compare them, you put them in this graph. You notice that all rich Western countries are really clustered. There are differences, but not huge differences. Gini of labor is between 0.4 and 0.6. Gini of capital, which is actually for me more important here, is between 0.85 and 0.95. The country which stands out, and I will not have a chance to talk about that, nor do I know that much, is Taiwan, because of the lower, significantly lower inequality of capital income, which is quite interesting and has historical background why it's the case. Now, let me go then to the second systemic inequality, higher rate of return on the assets of the rich. Now, remember, if the importance of capital income goes up, it would push incomes of the rich more simply because it is higher share of their income. But what happens on top of that? It might push it even more if the rich receive higher returns per unit of income that they have. Now, they might receive higher returns for two reasons. First, one is called the composition effect, because the rich people have different types of assets than the middle class. The poor people, we said before, have no assets, so we don't have to worry about that. Their assets are 0 or negative. But, so that goes all the way to the 40th percentile. From the 40th percentile to 95th percentile, most people have only housing in their assets, and some consumer durables, but very few financial assets. And for the rich people, for the top 5%, financial assets are really 80% of their overall net wealth or net worth. So what happens then is that really basically determined by the race between housing prices and returns on housing and financial assets. If financial assets overtake housing, as some people have been arguing, like Ed Wolf for the United States, then the return to the rich people is higher than for the middle class. But what is also very interesting, and I would actually suggest that to the students to study that, because very almost non-existent works, there are very few works on that, is whether within a given asset class there is a higher return to people who have more of that asset. In other words, the question that you ask, if I have 1 million euro and you have 1,000 euro, and we both go to some investment outfit and a mutual fund or somebody and invest, am I going to receive over the long term more in percentage return than you? And there are arguments that why, as you can see here is empirical stuff, rate of return for fixed income assets, why actually richer people might receive higher return. You know, there are, of course, first you have, of course, very high cost to entering to some of these high-yield instruments. Secondly, you might have better advisors if you have more money. So if you show up to a Swiss wealth management fund for 1 billion, I guarantee you they are going to pay lots of attention to you. But if you try to go there with 1,000 euro, you probably will not get past the doorman. So, you know, there is a difference between the two. The third element is what I actually had to create a name for, because that was something which has not been noticed before. And that name, of course, you go back to the Greek origins. What else would you do? And the name is homoploutia. Now, homoploutia is supposed to mean same wealth. I checked with my Greek friends. Nobody was very excited, but they say we cannot think of a better name. And this is actually the same individuals have high income from both capital and labor. Now look at this graph. It shows you how it has changed in the US. What is the percentage of people who are in top decile by labor, who are at the same time in the top decile by capital? So what you are having there, you're having really a removal or movement away from the classical capitalism. Now think what would happen if you had 100%. That would 100% would mean that if I take here one group of people, let's suppose in the last 3 rows, and say, well, they are really the people who have highest, they are the top income people by labor income. And they are all in the top decile by capital income. So you have the sort of accumulation of the advantages, both from capital and labor. So it's a very important development, because remember, in this graph, in classical capitalism, would be at 0. Because you would not have anybody who is a capitalist who is doubling up as a wage worker. And you would not have any wage workers who will be in the top decile by capital income. Now, this is not something which is, in the US, it's very dramatic. But when you do the same calculation of homoploutia for many countries, you basically find that about 25 to 30% of people from the top decile in labor are also in the top decile by capital. Now, where they are not are in countries like Mexico and Brazil, which are closer to typical capitalist countries. In other words, you can imagine that in Brazil, people who are very rich in terms of capital, they are not going to work like engineers also, or do some other wage labor. They would actually basically run their own enterprises, and very few of them would have significant labor income, or maybe many of them would have 0 in terms of labor income. So they would, you notice on this graph basically that when you take today's world, you have still the difference. I mean, you have a difference between more advanced countries that are really further away from classical capitalism and those who are less advanced. Now, I did the same over time, the graph for Spain. You have here sort of a standard 20%, 1/5 of the people who are in the top decile by labor are also in the top decile by capital. You see an increase in Spain as well, which again, as I said before, is not atypical. So where do we now go? Number 4, I've got almost coming to an end of this sort of a structural reasons, systemic reasons. That's the one that actually my students, when I presented in class, they pay most attention to, and that's why they should. It is really mating. It is assortative mating. So here it is the percentage, this is the calculation is done with the percentage of young, defined as 20 to 35 years of age, American males who are in the top decile by labor income. And whom are they marrying? Now, in the beginning, the fact that these 2 lines cross means that actually the likelihood of them marrying an equally rich woman from the top decile and a poor woman from the bottom decile is about the same. Now, what happens with a different cohort now, but of the same age, same decile and everything else, you notice now that the probability of marrying a rich woman is much higher than the probability of marrying a poor woman. It is really, the ratio is 3 to 1. So obviously now more men who are young, rich, marry young, rich women. Now, so that I should not be accused of a gender bias, I did the same thing for women. Now, there, the results are more striking even. So the ratio, the preferential ratio for women is now 5 to 1, and for men, as we have just seen, it was 3 to 1. Nevertheless, when you now put these last 2, homogamy and homoploutia, together, what you have there, you have the creation and that's something which is leads me to the next point, of a really essentially a self-sustaining upper class, where you have the same people having high capital incomes, high labor incomes, and marrying people who are equally having high labor incomes and high capital incomes. Then you need one more step to make sure that nobody really ever comes to dislodge you from that position. And that other step is that you need to have control over politics or policy. Now, this is from a graph by Martin Gillis. It's a complicated graph to explain, but let me just say that when you see this line going upwards, it means that as a given issue becomes more of importance to the rich people, that issue is more likely to be debated in Congress, voted about, or actually talked about in the news or whatever. If you take middle class people at the 50th percentile or poor people at the 10th percentile, whether an issue becomes more important for them or not doesn't make any difference. It's not more likely to be debated or voted or politically salient. So that is essentially what I call, like, essentially you're tying up the knot on political power, and the objective, of course, of that is the transmission of these advantages to the next generation. So if you're able to transmit all these advantages to the next generation, in which sense the schooling system plays an extremely important role, and the absence of significant inheritance taxation, then you have really solved the problem for at least several generations. You would have accumulated, as I said before, lots of capital income. That capital income, the return on that capital income would be higher than people who have less capital income. You would have married somebody who is equally rich like you. You would have accumulated both high labor and capital income. You would have transmitted that to your children, and they would go to the best schools and get best jobs, which would then, of course, give that sort of meritocratic or desert element to their incomes. So this is how I think the structure of the creation of a sort of a self-sustaining upper class functions. Now, of course, the result, I will go over that very briefly, is what we know. It is actually the shrinkage of the middle class in most of the countries. I will just go over the things. These are the definitions of the middle class, are not kind of randomly chosen. It is very sort of carefully chosen for every country. It is actually a number of people who are between 25% below the median and 25% above the median. You basically see that movement happening in all the countries, whether it be Finland or the United States. So it is not something which is only the United States. So now finally I come, what are then the recommendations and what is the policy, and then I'm finishing. I think you're giving, how many minutes do we have?
8 more minutes.
Oh, then I have lots of, so that's good. I was a little bit afraid. I just had, because we said we are going to be so tough on time that I actually overhurried. So I've got 8 minutes. Let me then go on the policy. To start thinking about policy, you have to start thinking about all these 6 systemic factors. Now, if you believe that there are some factors that you really cannot influence because of the changed nature of the job, because of technological change, because of globalization, and so on, then you have to say, do I believe that the tools that we have been using for the 20th century, which are the tools of the welfare state, and which are 4, in my opinion, 4 key tools, are these tools going to be strong enough to offset this quasi-automatic push towards higher inequality? Now, the 4 tools are, I think you can summarize it like that, are trade unions, higher number of years of education, higher taxation, and higher social transfers. And that's, I think, basically what the sort of a picture of the welfare state was built upon. Now, if you're a little bit skeptical about their sort of increased usefulness or power, you can say, trade unions, we know empirically, are on the decline, and actually they are on the decline in all the countries. The levels may be different, but if you look at OECD countries, there is, I don't think, a single country where the level has not gone down. And ironically, the levels are still kind of holding up when the state is the employer. So you have a really paradoxical situation from the point of view of the 19th century trade union movement, which was created to fight private employers, but now is really fighting the state mostly, because these are really the areas where actually the similarity of conditions has remained. Like, you know, doctors have the same issue. They are not being broken up into small units and, you know, working in like different parts of the country or dispersed. So the trade unions are the decline. Education, number of years of schooling, can be increased still, but we are really far from the situation that many countries were in the latter part of the 20th century, when you went from 6, 7 years of education or 8 years to 14. You're not going to go from 14 to 25. So you will have a limit there. And I think on taxation of the middle class that you would need also to increase, I think you have a political acceptance of that. So then the question becomes, and of course for the transfers, you cannot increase the transfers unless you tax more. So then the question becomes, what are the sort of solutions? I would actually, this is a nice graph that I was supposed to make mention before, but what it illustrates is that richer countries are not only richer in the sense of GDP, and they're not richer in terms of wealth only, but the ratio between wealth and GDP for them rises. In other words, Switzerland not only has much more wealth per unit, per individual than India, it has a much higher ratio of wealth to income. Now, why is it an important thing? Because as the rich countries become richer, they would actually have more of capital per each individual. And if the return on that capital doesn't go down, remember what I said before, in that case you would have a quasi-automatic increase in inequality. So what would be then the solutions, in my opinion, which would move us from liberal capitalism to people's capitalism? No, people's capitalism is not socialism. The word was even used by Margaret Thatcher, so it has really fully cleared right-wing credentials. You know, she used the word many times. So this could be viewed as also a right-wing approach, although I don't think that it's reasonable to view it like that, but let's, leave this aside. Now, what is there, the key part, is if you cannot use or increase the intensity of the instruments of distribution of the current income, it's like when you cook a dish and you have turned all your buttons there on your cooker at a maximum. You cannot increase it anymore. Now, what do you do then? Then you have, in my opinion, to go to a different approach, which is a pre-redistribution approach, which means that you make more equal distribution of assets. I've actually started this talk by emphasizing how unequally distributed is capital. But if you were to make capital much more equally distributed, and if you were to make skills, which means so-called human capital, more equally distributed, then you don't need so much of the redistribution of current income. Just to sort of fix the ideas, imagine that we basically have fairly egalitarian distribution of capital assets and fairly egalitarian distribution of skills, like everybody goes to school, everybody has done very well. The skill premium, which actually, by the way, Timbergen in the 1970s thought would go down to 0. So let's suppose that the skill premium is small. Then do you need really a huge, massive welfare state to redistribute? You don't. You need a welfare state to redistribute income over lifetime, because you need pensions, you need, when people age, you might need income for children when they're young, but you don't need a huge redistribution of current income. So that was the idea of the pre-redistribution and of the focus on more widely owned capital, because if capital concentration is less, then you don't have the transmission into higher inequality automatically. And the question is, how shall we do it? I leave this part on a very general level, because different countries might want to do it differently. But you can imagine there are different ways: workers' shareholding, employee stock ownership plans, special incentives for small investors, an investment guarantee agency for small investors, inheritance taxation with transfers of capital grants to the young people, like, for example, what Atkinson has suggested. So there is really a number of means to do that. You're not going to change this blue line of the Gini, which is 0.9. It's not going to go immediately down, but it will start gradually going down. So maybe in 20 or 40 years, in 1 or 2 generations, you might have the blue line and the red line coincide, and in that case, becoming richer by having more capital and having a larger chunk of your total GDP go to capital owners would not automatically produce inequality. The second thing is, what do you do with the other factor of production, which is labor? Then obviously here, equal access to equal quality of education is crucial. Now, for I will not go over all of that, but for the United States, that's absolutely, now we have much more data than before. Actually, until about 5-6 years ago, we had almost no data, but basically what you can see here is that it's very highly correlated with income. People who go to the best schools, which then lead, and that's the key part, which then lead to high incomes, are on this account here 77 times more likely than the people from the bottom quintile. In other words, it compares the position of the top 1% with the bottom. This is obviously from Chetty and others, it is actually, this is the college attendance rates by parental income. This is like totally, as you can see, correlated. It is actually, as the parental income goes up, more people go to college. So in the case of the United States, I think it's an easy thing to actually argue that the educational system is really a huge contributor to that maintenance, or the creation and the maintenance of a self-sustaining elite. The other thing which is extremely important is the control of the political process by this is my last slide, by the rich. So what was actually interesting there, I tweeted that number in anticipation of today's talk. When you look, this is again empirical stuff which we didn't have until recently. If you look at the fact that the top 1% of the top 1%, so we are talking here of 100 over 100, is responsible for about 40% of campaign contributions. You have such an incredible concentration in campaign contributions, and you have an incredible concentration in access to top schooling, and you have an incredible concentration in assets or wealth. So these are the things actually which have to be broken if you want to prevent the creation of the plutocracy. So here I've listed then the issues, I've listed possible remedies. I think on the increasing aggregate share of capital in national income, we cannot do that much. We can do some, like with demonopolization and so on, but I think this is the result of an external shock of globalization, and that will probably continue, and technological change. On the other things, high concentration of capital ownership, I've already explained that, what I think can be done. High rate of return on the assets of the rich, increased taxation of capital gains. On homoplutia and homogamy, there is nothing we can do. On homogamy, we cannot actually introduce the Plato or arrange marriages, although, that could be a solution. But you would actually, of course, probably have worse effect from reducing inequality and happiness of people than you would get from sort of greater equality. So that you can do nothing on these two things. Control of the political process by the rich, absolutely crucial, I believe, electoral reform and reform on the funding of political parties, not only of the United States, but also in Europe. As we have seen, most of the scandals which have to do with, bribery and other things have really been related to the funding of the political campaigns. And finally, greater transmission of income and wealth across generations. Here, really taxation of inheritance and public education, which indeed is really at least what Rawls thought at least we should have in order to have liberal equality. So essentially what I argue is that we have to move away from the use of the 20th century instruments to control equality to the use of the 21st century instruments to control inequality, which would be focused on endowments of labor and capital. And we need to go for the reform of the funding of the political parties. So that would be the sort of a summary of chapter 2. And when you come tomorrow, I'll talk about chapter 3, and the after day, I'll talk about chapter 4, and then so we'll continue. So thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so thank you very much, the IBEI, for organizing this event and for inviting me to discuss Branko's book. In fact, it's a great pleasure to be here because I did a postdoc here at Pompeu Fabra. So I'm really glad to be here. And thank you, Branko, for writing this very interesting book. So basically what I'm going to do is I want to do three things. Let's see if I have enough time. So basically I want to discuss, and I'm going to do one thing. I'm going to be focusing mainly on advanced economies. So in fact, it's going to be I hope it's going to be a pretty nice kind of follow-up of what Branko has been explaining until now. Although I'm going to touch a little bit on the relationship between globalization and capitalism. So first I want to discuss a little bit these mechanisms for self-enforcing inequality, which I think is one of the things in which the book is making an important contributions. And in fact, I think Branko is one of these intellectuals that he does one important thing, which is he is making visible things that sometimes are not so visible to many of us. So in fact, when he's discussing this mechanism of homoplutia, I think he's putting on the table some very important mechanism that was not really visible until now. In the same way that in the previous book, the Global Inequality book, he was basically saying, look, there are good reasons to worry, not exactly about inequality within countries, but also about global inequalities and the extent to which location or geography makes a very important difference. Then I would like to talk a little bit about the politics of inequality and representation, because I think that's one of the main kind of contributions of the book as well. And then I will discuss a little bit the policy proposals that Branko was very nicely summarizing here. Okay, so the first thing, these dynamics of self-reinforcing inequality, here I'm basically plotting the same graphs that Branko was showing now. So he says, well, this is homoplutia at work. And basically what is happening, and I think it's pretty important, is we are basically seeing three things here. One thing is these already very high levels of the Gini concentration for capital. So here, if we focus on Spain, what you can see is that, for example, democracy has been unable to deconcentrate capital. The second important thing is this gradual increase in this Gini for labor income. And this is not only Spain, this is a pattern that it's systematic across many OECD countries. But the combination of these two things, and this is really the important point, is the rise of homoplutia. Is this basically this phenomena in which we have a concentration of people that get capital from income and also capital from, or earnings from capital. So then we have kind of a problem, which is the essence of what Branko is defining as liberal capitalism, in which we have this increasing concentration by people at the same time, that is kind of concentrating income from capital and income from labor. Okay, here I would like to point a couple of extra things, which is we know that this is happening at the same time in a context of increasing segmentation and increasing segregation. This is data from David Autor. Basically, what we can see here is that over time, okay, the share of college-educated people is increasingly correlated with living in urban areas, okay? So this is an important thing. And the second important thing is that at the same time, we see a process of segregation, of divergence, which is, of course, we know that the college premium is also increasing, okay? Why I'm emphasizing this? Well, basically because of two things. One is that this is gonna reinforce the mechanism of reproduction of inequality, okay? But this is also pointing towards the importance of two things: housing policy and labor mobility policy. Because if this is the pattern, if we have homoplutia at work, homogamy, and increasing segmentation and increasing segregation, then we have a role, a very important role, I would say, for housing and for mobility policies. The second thing I was saying this is because of a problematic thing, which is, I think this poses a very severe challenge for left parties, because this somehow is breaking up the nature coalition for left parties. If we have this increasing self-reproduction of inequality, plus a context of segmentation and segregation, the possibility that a mainstream left party is going to construct an electoral base out of it, this is a terrible challenge. In fact, there is some people like Jane Gingrich at Oxford working exactly on this. So I think this is important to think also about the policy implications regarding housing and mobility. Of course, we know that one of the main reasons behind this is the very kind of this upper part here, this very steep increasing college wage premium, okay? So basically this increase in the labor income is related to these college wage premiums, but again, this correlates with urban locations of highly educated people that on top of that are marrying to each other. So we have a very strong mechanism for the self-reproduction of inequality in advanced economies, okay? That is challenging, or I would say very challenging for left-wing parties. Okay, so now I want to say a few things about the politics of inequality. So basically what Branko is doing in the book, and it was very clear in the presentation already, is to emphasize this mechanism of affluence and influence, okay? This is something that especially the political scientists in the US have already been working on for quite a lot now. Okay, so this is data from Nolan McCarthy, and this is well documented by now for the US. And the important thing in this graph is the positive correlation between Gini, income inequality, and the amount of political polarization in the US. So from a purely descriptive point of view, we know that there is a very positive correlation between economic inequality and political polarization. And then the mechanism of affluence and influence that Branko is also describing is basically this one. At the same time, we know that the share of campaign contributions that the top percent is doing has been increasing very dramatically since the late 90s, okay? In fact, it's one of these kind of cases of a Pareto distribution because you can see this very steep increase in the campaign contributions by the top percent, but also if you take just the top 1400, you see this dramatic increase in campaign contributions. Okay, so what I'm saying here is that there is this positive correlation between economic inequality and political polarization, and this is well documented for the US. So there seems to be a lot of evidence for this affluence and influence channel that Branko is also suggesting the importance of it. In Europe, however, and I think this is pretty interesting, this is not so clear. So this is data across European countries, and what you see here is that in the top left corner, you see that in the good old kind of Scandinavian countries like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, these are of course countries with low economic inequality. But according to this data, and surprisingly enough, you can see that polarization, okay, the share of non-centrist voting is also very high. So here we seem to have kind of a tale of two countries, or a tale of two worlds, because in the US we seem to have this very positive correlation between economic inequality and political polarization, but across European countries, what we were observing, maybe these are the good old times. Maybe in the future this is not going to be any more like that. But we seem to have this evidence that not so long ago, we had this case in which we had countries with low inequality and still a lot of political polarization. So what was, this is by the way from an article by Iverson and Soskis. So the argument is that maybe to avoid the positive correlation between economic inequality and political polarization is that we need the two things on the right. We need highly informed voters and agents of political mobilization, like unions. So there seems to be kind of a different story here, which is quite different from the affluence and influence story, that maybe was the case in Europe, that is the following. When we have highly informed voters and agents or institutions of political mobilization, maybe we can break up this affluence and influence channel. So I'm just saying this to kind of suggest that we need to understand kind of the scope conditions for the mechanism of affluence and influence. Because in fact, we have some evidence that in some European countries, we observed political polarization, parties competing on the economic dimension, and this going hand in hand with low inequality, okay? So maybe it's kind of, there is no deterministic relationship between economic inequality and the type of political responses. And in fact, this kind of a broad, kind of a common denominator of my talk is to try to break a little bit kind of these relationships between economic fundamentals and the political responses. And this is going to be also my point in here. Okay, so this is, let me do a little bit of a detour here, which is the following. In Branko's book, there is a very nice and very controversial proposal about immigration that Branko started in a very kind of interesting op-ed piece in the Financial Times a couple of years ago. So what Branko is suggesting is that there might be a trade-off for natives in terms of the amount of immigration that should come in and kind of the welfare provision that we should give to them, okay? And here it's also one of these cases in which Branko is making visible things that are not so visible, because my understanding is that the ultimate reason for justifying this is that, well, there might be a stock of potential migrants that if we do not regulate things, are not going to migrate, okay? So that is the relevant counterfactual, okay? We want to allow immigration because it's going to be a good thing for kind of from a global inequality perspective, okay? But this might pose a trade-off for the national median voters, okay? So Branko is making an interesting and very controversial policy proposal because it basically implies kind of a proposal in which immigrants might have differentiated rights, okay? But what I want to point with this data that I'm showing here is to what extent national median voters are already internalizing this trade-off. And the second reason why I'm showing this is also to try to break or to try to provoke Branko a little bit this kind of strong determinism between economic fundamentals and political responses. Okay, so this is from a paper in which basically I studied the political responses by the median voter to increasing inequality and increasing immigration. And one of the interesting things that we are finding is that so don't focus on this graph because this is a little bit technical. I'm gonna just explain the intuitions. So what these marginal effects are showing is the following. When the inequality that is relevant, the inequality that is increasing is inequality at the upper part of the income distribution, okay? And at the same time, immigration is also increasing, okay? What mainstream parties, both left and right mainstream parties, seems to do is to become a little bit more pro-redistribution, but also more pro-authoritarian, more nationalist. So what this means is that there seems to be kind of a coalition in which the national median voter reacts to increasing immigration and increasing inequality by becoming a little bit more pro-redistributive, but also more authoritarian. The opposite is true, however, when the inequality that is increasing is inequality at the lower part of the income distribution. When that's the case, the median voter becomes less pro-redistributive, but also less authoritarian. So what I'm saying is that somehow the national median voter seems to internalize the costs of increasing immigration. So there is kind of a tension here about to what extent the policy proposal, kind of thinking like an economist, like a second best policy proposal, to what extent in kind of true politics, the national median voters are already internalizing this, okay? Okay, and the last thing I'm gonna do is to discuss a little bit the policy proposals. I'm gonna be quicker here. I think talking about policy proposals is generally a very interesting thing to do, but even more in this case, or in this book, basically because of the reason I was saying before, because Branko is making visible some important systematic patterns that were not visible before. So is Branko proposing kind of a coming back to classical social democracy remedies? Not at all, okay? In fact, it was very clear already from his presentation. He's basically saying, well, we need somehow to limit the increase in the aggregate share of capital and to limit the transmission that the elite does across generations. So for that, kind of the traditional remedies were stronger unions, taxation of inheritance, public education, but that's not the focus that Branko is kind of putting. What he's suggesting is the importance of taking more innovative measures to facilitate these, what he called the transitions to people capitalism, like tax advantages to the middle class, stock ownership plans for the middle class, etc. But I want to finish with this kind of this table, which is, there seems to be an emerging consensus among many people saying, well, then we should focus more on pre-redistribution intervention, okay? Many people is talking about that, and it's kind of suggesting a dichotomy between intervening at the stage of production, like pre-redistributive intervention, or intervening at the stage of post-production. What I want to suggest with this table, that it's from Danny Roderick, is that maybe instead it would be more interesting to focus on the diagonal, the elements, the cells in the diagonal. Why is that? Because I think it's basically what Branko is suggesting, and to me it's really interesting, which is, if we are worried about inequality at the bottom, okay, then we should really promote endowment policies, especially education. If we worry about the middle class, okay, then we need to promote good jobs. And if we worry about the top, we need to tax with wealth taxes and inheritance taxes. So what I'm trying to do here is to break a little bit this dichotomy, which is very present in journalistic accounts, between pre-redistribution and ex ante and ex post, and basically saying, well, if we focus on the different types of inequality at the bottom, at the middle, at the top, maybe it's more interesting to focus on the diagonal, which I think it's kind of a summary as well of what Branko is suggesting. But thank you very much.
Okay, well, so I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes, and believe me, it's more difficult to talk for 10 minutes than for 20. Well, I have to confess, I've been a fan of Branko's book for some time ago already, and I always find them very interesting, insightful, solid, informative, and thought-provoking, and this one is no exception. So there is so much food for thought, it's difficult to choose where to focus on. I'm going to do it in chapter 3, political capitalism, because it's more relevant for the global south. In that chapter, Branko's main argument, and I quote, is that this political capitalism is in many cases a product of communist revolutions conducted in societies that were colonized or de facto colonized, such as China. Then communism enabled such societies to abolish feudalism, regain independence, and build endogenous capitalism. So Branko's exposition of this type of capitalism, the political one, is driven by the focus in placing communism within the global history, and also by the recent examples of China and Vietnam, which are, I think, his darlings in the book. But in my view, I think he's overlooking the relevance of a different type of authoritarian system in which communist revolutions played no part, at least directly. And then we are talking the non-communist political capitalism. It's granted that Branko cannot talk about everything, yeah, but I think this is relevant experiences. So we need to be talking about South Korea, Taiwan, and Latin America. Branko is addressing South Korea, Taiwan on as already meritocratic, liberal, capitalist societies, but not before as authoritarians. So let me introduce. This is a chart showing the Asian miracles. The first one, Japan, of course. The second round, South Korea and Taiwan. And then the third wave is China, and possibly the fourth miracle is in the making is Vietnam. So one wonders if we should keep talking about miracles, yeah, when we look at East Asia. Also, notice I'm highlighting 3 marks here in that catching up process. So 0.1 or 10% of the US income per capita, which is poor economies, and taking off position. 30% of the US income per capita is where China is now, and we will see it's already graduating into middle income countries. And then there is the 50%, which is consolidating that catching up process, okay? And so you can see how Taiwan and South Korea did that very quickly. And after reaching 50%, continue growing, and then caught up with Japan, overtook it, and keep going. There is a blip in South Korea because of the Asian crisis there. So those, and then those two countries see in 1990, around 1990, they transition into democracies. Until then, they were authoritarian regime, non-communist. And then there is a transition of democracy, and then join the liberal capitalist type. Then we have the Latin American case, okay? So Latin American, again, because more recently there are plenty of democracies, many of those are at risk, but in the 1960s and 70s, what we had in Latin America were a lot of military rule, sort of technocratic regimes. And then Guillermo O'Donnell called those type of regimes bureaucratic authoritarianism, which is a close relative to the political capitalism, but non-communist. So there were only 3 communist revolutions in Latin America: Cuba, 1959 onwards, Nicaragua, 90, and Grenada, briefly, 1783, all 3 with modest economic growth. Why is it important to consider this sort of type of non-communist political capitalism? Well, I think at least 3 reasons. Yeah? And by the way, 3 is a magic number in Branko's book. Yeah, so in the reasoning, so I try to keep with the 3 numbers in the way of explaining things, which I find it very clever. Why 3 reasons? Well, they show that communism is not so pervasive as a key feature of political capitalism, including successful stories. Okay? So perhaps the necessary ingredient is to be found in Asian-specific common features rather than in communist revolutions. Yeah? And second point is, contrary to system continuity in China and the US, which are the two examples of Branko, but it is democracy and authoritarian regimes all the way. But what we have in the global south, of course, is a lot of examples of transitions between those two regimes, or close to those ideal types. And also the global south has been a very fertile ground for experimenting with those systems. So I'll give you an example of Nicaragua. So in Nicaragua, we go in the last 50 years. So non-communist political capitalism, then communist revolution, political capitalism, then back democracy, sort of liberal capitalism, then back to political capitalism in a matter of 50 years. And third, a relevant reason here is that because South Korea offers an earlier debate about transferability of a successful East Asian model into the developing world, particularly Africa. And of course, this is the work by, has to be mentioned, Alice Amsden here. So, which leads me to the second point. Prospects for Africa. Paul Collier, in his book, The Bottom Billion, says that Africa missed the boat of export diversification and industrialization during the 1980s, 1990s. So the question is, well, will this time be different? Okay, and that's this second chart. All this data with the Madison Project. So we got Africa in green. So you see very low, stagnant sort of aggregate average performance below the 10% of the US value. This is more or less Vietnam. India, up to 2000, was about like this. And then we go Latin America. In black is the old countries. In the gray thing is this selection of countries for which we got a longer view in history. And you can see this process of reversion to the mean of this level of the 30%. It seems to Latin America finds this very difficult to go beyond that 30%. The latest increase in catch-up here is because of this commodity boom. Nothing to do much about industrialization here in those two regions. So what is Branko saying? Well, he's bringing up new elements here. This time may be different because of two reasons. The Belt and Road Initiative, building infrastructure for China in Africa, for instance, in other Asian countries, and the global value chain, opening the possibility of reallocating production from China into other countries. Now, he's also, well, would this model of China be transferable? Well, and he's not very optimistic for two reasons, mainly because difficult to replicate something which is an essential part of the Chinese model, which is regionally decentralized authoritarian system, and also because of these corrupt governments, non-efficient governments in, let's say, Africa, will mean lower growth, and this is not compatible with working on that system. And I would add to that China itself, because companies will prefer keeping in Asia, economies of agglomeration, human capital, political stability, and also because Asia interest in natural resources. Okay, this is a mixed blessing. Okay, so because Africa in the next 30 years will be in this context of rapid urbanization and high population growth. So we can rephrase that question of that, will this time be different? I think the question is about, will rapid urbanization in Africa be with or without industrialization? Okay, and this is more or less the work by Douglas Golding in Oxford. I mean, he's asking that question. We got three possible scenarios here. We got three possible scenarios without no industrialization, so keep dependency of natural resources, urbanized Africa based on export of those resources, basically the same sort of situation they are now. But I think this isn't likely because they are already promising trends of changes, at least in some parts of Africa. The other option is, the second option is with industrialization, East Asian type, which I think is very unlikely. Yeah? And maybe Vietnam, better example like China for African countries. Yeah? And the third option, which I think is most likely, is of course something in between, which is the Latin American type of situation, semi-industrial economies based, still dependent on natural resources. And then of course that, just to finish my commentary, if we are talking about capitalism and inequality, we need to talk about Chile. Chile is a very important case. Chile is now a liberal democracy, but is in the news. Let me show you the remarkable, something remarkable that happened in Chile is from 1990 onwards, that's democracy onwards, yeah, in the last 30 years. That this is not a Latin American pattern of economic growth. So we got Chile, leaving this trap of the 30% income, relative income, and reaching the 50%, so consolidating 50%. And now when the troubles broke, and that's where we are now, and so there are questions or casting doubts if that model will continue and is valid, and also if this is a valid example of a model of capitalism for the rest of Latin America and, I say, as well for Africa. So the things also to notice with Chile is that it's high inequality country, let's say compared to South Korea and Taiwan, low inequality, but mostly because of pre-distribution. You see, when we talk about Latin America, or I think Africa as well, we need to assume high inequality was always high. Yeah? It's not the case when the discussion is on Europe, that you're talking about rising inequality. So in Latin America, it's a given. So it's a starting point, high inequality, and then we look at growth. Okay? Now I give Branko the opportunity to answer both interventions, and then we open up for general questions.
If I remember well, I have 5 minutes, right? Okay, I will. Okay, thanks really to both Cesc and Pablo for excellent comments. I took notes of them, and of course I hope also to get your slides, but I cannot rewrite the book, it's too late. But they are really excellent, so let me go very quickly. What I really appreciated in Cesc's comments was that it seemed to me that what, of course, I have sketched today, and if you were to build up this political discussion, that of course he is much more familiar than I think it seems to you have an almost entire kind of an engine and a model where you have economic forces and then you have superimposed to that much better discussion of the political forces. I am, as I was accused of economic determinism, and I am actually somewhat economic determinist. Which it's like a sort of occupational hazard. It comes with being an economist, So I agree with that, and I think actually they're very, very interesting things, particularly with the segmentation and what segmentation implies both, for housing and labor mobility. And I really found that extremely interesting, and the difficulty of leftist parties creating a coalition, which, by the way, of course, is one of the main themes, as Cesc knows, in Piketty's new book. It's actually the difficulty. And what I actually liked very much in your presentation also is that everybody's talking about the difficulty, but it's one thing that you talk about difficulty and just in an abstract sense, and a different thing when you draw it from some logical discussion of the changes or the trends. And in that sense, I also tried, when I went into the discussion of the recommendations, to actually show that these recommendations come from some sort of I hope logical sort of sketch of reality and identification of the problems. Because clearly everybody can say, well, I'm in favor of high taxation on inheritance, but you have to put that in some framework why you're in favor of that. And of course the framework that you at the end suggested, which goes back to also which Danny Roderick did, it's very good in highlighting that particular sort of, highlighting different tools that you can use. And I have not heard that actually using the diagonal, so I did like that because it very much is what, of course, I agree with, although I have not put it in such terms. Finally, the issue of migration, it's a very big topic, so I'll be very brief. Of course, I discuss it quite a lot in the book. As Cesc said, it's very controversial because it really sort of calls for the introduction of different levels of citizenship. I intentionally use the word, because some people really get angry at that word, of using the word of sub-citizens. It doesn't sound good, but it's actually what it is. And I explain why I believe that it is a better policy than the alternative, which could be Fortress Europe or Fortress United States. So I don't have time here to do that, but you're most welcome to read it in the book. So I don't come to that position, which is a position of circular migration, because I don't like immigrants. I'm one myself. And because I really would like to stop everybody else from migrating. I come to that position because I have a fear that unless a sort of a moderate position is taken on that, number of European countries are going to shut the door, and they're in the process of doing that. And they're shutting the door, I think, actually because of the median voter, although, as Cesc has very persuasively explained, that median voter reacts differently to the inequality to the bottom and the top. And actually, that's something that I really would like to learn more, because that was something new for me when you showed the results that you have. So now let me also very briefly go over Pablo's comments, which were excellent. Let me just recognize one thing, and Pablo is totally right on that. My book really doesn't deal much with Latin America, nor much with Africa. And not, ironically, much with Russia. Why I say ironically? Russia is hardly mentioned, because the political capitalism, the derivation of political capitalism, is based on looking at countries which were colonized and where communist or quasi-communist revolutions took place. Latin America, of course, became sort of free or independent in the early 19th century. So it basically, by the time that I start looking, it's kind of already in a different, it's not there anymore. Russia was not colonized, so it falls out because of that. Now, of course, China is the most important country with the United States now, so there is a little bit of the sort of a China bias in what I do. But I do list, actually, a number of countries. So China and Vietnam are the best examples. But there are others, Ethiopia, Algeria, Rwanda, Myanmar, which are also mentioned there, Singapore, and even Malaysia. And what is characteristic is there was, in actually all cases, violent struggle for independence, in many of them led by communist parties or quasi-communist parties. The real counterparts to what I'm saying, and actually I said this in a podcast the other day in London, if you really want to go after my stuff, that's India and Indonesia, which are useful as antipodes, As I was saying before, Russia, ironically, now plays, it's a little bit, nobody has noticed that because it's in an annex, plays a very paradoxical role of the enabler of China's capitalism. Now, you have to be really good dialectical Marxist to understand why Russia played that role, but I would sort of leave that, skip that part, it's in the annex, but it really doesn't play much of a role in the book. So I definitely would like, actually, I mean, if I could go to, include other countries, but as I said, in a very sort of, how should I say, in a sketch of the two dominant systems. I think that, of course, China and the United States played a key role, and also in the discussion of which of course I didn't do today, of the factors that push Chinese inequality up. And so, last point, Pablo mentioned that actually I use these three very often. In the China chapter, again, I have to give you a little bit of a sort of a secret of the author. I use intentionally, I tried a little bit to mimic Chinese approach of 5 good classes, 4 bad classes, 3 key reasons, this kind of, and I have, which I think is new, 3 key characteristics of the system and 2 crucial contradictions of the system. So there is a little bit of mimicking, but I think it is useful to, as a mnemonic. First, it's useful as a definition, but I think it's useful as a mnemonic tool for people, including the author, to remember what really he wanted or she wanted to say. The final point is actually that I think that one of the things is implied towards the end of the book, but in a rather moderate way, is the possibility of the convergence of the two systems. The convergence could come through essentially the two elites controlling both political and economic space. In the case of liberal capitalism, it would come through a wealthy elite taking over political space, which is already kind of happening largely. And in the other case, which is also happening to some extent in China, political elite becoming rich and using, of course, political office for private gain, and then basically concentrating to two powers. So, you know, I'm sort of saying that there is a possibility of a convergence that we did not in the Fukuyama time think likely, but which I think we cannot exclude the fact that actually both systems might become plutocracies.
Thank you. So we open the time for the question from the audience. So we're going to take three at a time and then give the chance to answer.
Well, thank you very much first for your extremely interesting talk. I have a question that you're probably expecting about the Spanish story. No? Because in the case of Spain, what we see is from the 1980s till 2000, there is actually the decrease in capital income inequality and decrease in homoplutia, and then it goes up again. So what exactly is the mechanism for this? And to ask immediately why we don't see, or what, for instance, the pattern in the UK or the US is simply very stable levels of capital income inequality around 0.9. Because my first thought was, of course, the housing issue, but then again, this is exactly something that we have in these other countries. So what explains the Spanish dynamics? Thanks.
Yeah, two more, yeah.
Here and then at the back, 2 and 3, and then we give the time.
Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. Here.
I'm sorry, who is it? Yeah.
I just wanted to know a little bit about the corruption you mentioned in the beginning. Yeah. So if corruption, when you talk about capital, you are thinking in the corruption inside this capital, or it's outside when you talk about capital? That's it. Thank you.
Hi, thanks again for the talk. I just wanted to know your opinion on the argument that pension funds or sovereign wealth funds can be a transmission mechanism for translating capital gains more widely, and if you had an opinion on the rise of index funds and the role they're playing in kind of aggregating capital and potentially changing capital markets.
Okay. Be brief, because of course, unfortunately, I really cannot say much on some of these questions. So let me start with Spain. You know, the graphs that I showed today are not actually in the book. I gave them because of, you know, I'm presenting this here. So I don't know, actually. I think it is a topic for somebody who would like to do a dissertation or something, you know. I mean, of course, there's much work done on Spain for inequality and the rise of labor income inequality. Actually, Cesc mentioned that before, very clear increase in labor Gini. The capital Gini, as you said, actually, it's very high in all countries. There is not that much variability. Simply when you're very, very high up, you don't really change very much. So you know, if you're at 90 and 95, you cannot go like beyond that. You might go a little bit below, and then the range is between 85 and 95, and even the data that we have are based on samples, you know, and really, essentially, you cannot tell that a sample which gives you a Gini of 93 is different from a sample that gives you a Gini of 89, you know. So these are very, very high numbers. And, you know, I think that was actually, that for Spain, as I said, I really don't know. And I think what needs to be possibly done if this whole homoplutia, which is a new concept, takes over, is really to study of homoplutia because you have the numbers, actually could be studied for Spain and other countries. Homogamy, for example, has been, I'm sure it's not a question, but just want to mention that there are many more studies now of homogamy than like 10 years ago. And they are basically same stories, but not entirely, and goes back a little bit to the difference that Cesc mentioned between Europe and the United States. For example, in Italy, they find extremely high correlation of homogamy among the top 1 or 5%, but not the rest. So it's a very interesting kind, and could be in Spain as well, that really very, if I read like middle pages in the newspapers, I find always these political leaders and or women, political leaders, dating actors. And this is I think a very interesting case of like top, dating or marrying top. On corruption, I deal with corruption in the case of China and in global case. In the case of China, as I said before, I actually have three definitions, three key features. That's an efficient bureaucracy, absence of rule of law, and autonomy of the state. Now, the contradiction between the first and the second, efficient Weberian type of bureaucracy and absence of rule of law, is corruption. So I think that corruption in China is endemic to the system. It's a setup within the setup of the system. I actually have some interesting Chinese data. You have some graphs there which show actually correlation between the level of corruption, mostly selling of offices, what is called simony. In China, and how, of course, it increases with the level of administrative authority. So it's lower at the prefecture level, and of course, highest at the provincial level. And I presented that in China, and one thing that was also very nice in those data, these are official data, that actually you have higher returns to party if you're a party member than if you're not. So in other words, at every given administrative level, if you're a party member and sell a given office, you make more money. So that shows you, of course, where more greater power is concentrated, or it exists. And then I discuss it in respect to globalization, and I do think there that actually chances of fighting corruption are slim. Not only because the engines of corruptions are in the countries that we normally talk, Nigeria, Russia, Ukraine, and stuff like that, but because the enablers of that corruption are in the rich world. There would not be a corruption without the whole system which enables that corruption which was set up in London and New York and now in Singapore and elsewhere. So, and that system, which I also call, there was a nice term, I think actually you should start using it, it's moral corruption. I think it's a very important one because it shows you that the best way to sort of, what is called, do blanchissement of your income is, as it was done, for example, is to actually use that money to buy sort of goodwill through investments in arts, education, think tanks, things like that. And so if you want really to go after corruption, you would have to close down a bunch of these, not loopholes, but these ways in which people fund, research, institutes, art galleries, concerts, and then, of course, you would lose also money from lawyers. The largest lawsuit ever in history was between Abramovich and who was the guy who committed suicide, Russian guy. It ran into millions and millions of dollars, and who made that money? The lawyers. So, Berezovsky. So anyway, so that's on the corruption. And the last one on wealth funds, I don't mention that. I mentioned very briefly because I'm not very specific, but I do believe it is actually a good way to, of course, distribute ownership in the same way that, for example, the Labour Party's proposals go to some extent towards that. And in the old-fashioned, also trade unions in Sweden had very similar idea in the, I think it was 1980s or 70s even, when they actually would have the fund, and the proceeds of the fund would be actually distributed as dividends to workers. So all of that, whatever measure, aims to reduce concentration of capital, I think it's a good measure.
Thank you, Branko. We can take another round of
Thank you very much. This was really great, and I'm really enjoying the conversation here. So my question is about the KL ratio that you mentioned as a central pillar of your talk. So from what I can also see, the holders of capital are also creators of capital, and that's why this KL ratio has grown to the levels it has under liberal capitalism, they're also creators, for instance, of private creators of money. So if I'm a CEO of a bank, I basically, I'm responsible for giving out loans, and the more loans I give, maybe that basically comes back as a payment in this form of shares, and I also make money as from capital gains. So my question is, the proposal that you make under people's capitalism does not give people any power to create money, to create capital, but rather owners. I mean, you're basically emphasizing ownership. To what extent can you sustain low levels of KL ratio by, ownership of shares or pension funds or dividend from such proceeds without actually having the power to create money? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed this talk a lot as well. So my questions are sort of threefold, but they're all interconnected. So the first one was actually related to sort of, the first that I had was about your definition of capitalism from the start and the focus on differentiating these systems based upon relationships to capital and labor. And it struck me that actually, was a simplification in certain respects, of course, but you didn't say much about other things like the competitiveness of markets, reliance of markets, or the traditional sort of other aspects of the way I think of capitalism as a distinct system. And so then that sort of related to my next thought, which was that one of the things that, you emphasize these different systemic drivers that I think didn't come out for me as strongly, and maybe it could be lumped into sort of political control of the system, or control of the political system, is related to competition in markets. And one of the things that I think that we see increasingly, which plays into the growth of inequality, is actually the concentration of capital itself and monopolization, and that essentially results in transfers from consumers, and the majority of them being owners or laborers, to capital, and that's a really important mechanism for driving inequality. And so I was wondering to what degree you agree with that, but then it also comes into your policy prescriptions, because I noticed that you put sort of antitrust policy in the same sort of category as labor unions, as being essentially having no part to play in addressing any of these issues. And I wonder why it is that you say that. So there's sort of three interconnected thoughts there.
Any other questions for this round?
Next round one. Final zero. Okay. On the first fully asked question, I really have to plead that I did not look at money creation and financial policies. For me, and it's a little bit answering your question, but I'll come to that in a minute. For me, ownership, somewhat in a classical sense, is crucial. It's actually, the definition, going to Charlie's question, I'll come back also to yours, the definition of capitalism that I didn't have a chance to say today, but I take it straightforwardly from Marx and Max Weber. There is nothing new there. It's a very parsimonious definition. It's the definition that says, and actually it looks at the two factors of production and coordination mechanism. And I think it's a beautiful definition because it's simple. It is actually most of production carried for profit on the privately owned means of production. Most of the labor, wage labor, so labor is being hired by capital, not the other way around, and the coordination decentralized. And that's my definition. Now, of course, there are many other sort of revisions, additions to that, but I believe that actually, if we want to talk about things at a fairly high level of abstraction, I really believe that the very classical definition, which goes after ownership, is absolutely crucial, because that ownership is not abstract itself. That ownership leads, of course, to income, and leading to income, of course, leads to inequality. And so that actually goes also, I think, to Fulya's question, is that I did not, of course, look at money creation. I really look at, if there is a money creation there, I look at the effect of that money creation of ownership, or who gets that money. For example, if ECB prints the money, who gets the money, whether the asset prices go up, and so on. So that was like, and also I think there is a certain logic there, which is the following that actually Charlie asked me, is my interest is to look at how the two systems distribute income and how they might lead to the creation of a self-sustaining upper class or an elite. So the production side, partly because it has not been in my life an interest that I had, is left aside. Now, I'm not saying that it's not important, maybe it's extremely important, but that's why I really don't discuss much the issue, as you said, actually, antitrust, even labor unions are discussed in passing, but all the sort of policies that would, in that, for example, graph that Cesc brought, they would be in the middle. You know, that middle column would be the production column, you know. My column is actually not, my book is not really focused on that production column. So that's the, you know, just to summarize, actually the definition of capitalism is very classical, and the discussion is distribution and a class formation, or social reproduction, if you want to use it different way. So, but I know that this issue that you raised would come back. It already did. For example, Marshall Steinbaum, who also liked very much my book, and I mean, he's going to be a commentator of my book in New York. I'm sure he would raise this issue because his interest is really on that middle, you know, column.
Thank you very much for everybody to have talked. Branko got this idea, the free book, you know, that thought to be given to the first three persons that asked questions. So